Right, so here we are. And yes, Chof Daled Amud Beis. Do you remember we were speaking about this last week? And we're talking here about making these it wasn't really signs, there were diagrams of the moon. Do you remember? We're talking about the previous Mishnah where the great Rabban Gamliel had these pictures, illustrations. It sounds like they're up on his wall. He had these pictures, and of course, with those pictures, he would be testing the witnesses that would come, what the shape, the size, how high up, which way was it facing, etc. So he'd really be pointing to for them to decide what they'd seen. And the question that we have been grappling with is, are you allowed actually, the various psukim we've seen, that you can't make form and of things which are in Shamayim, things lo sasun iti, don't make things, the Pasuk says in the end of Yisro, don't make things which are close, which means in Shamayim, you cannot make forms of those. We ended up saying that it's fine for, remember the sun and the moon. We said, if you were making them, I'm just picking this up here, you can't make these items, but other people can make them for you. And we explained in the case of Rabbi Gamliel that he had other people making it. It didn't, because it was a mitzvah that he was performing, because he was testing the witnesses. Other people, he said, lo sasun, you shouldn't make these images. And therefore he had other people making these images, and that was fine. Then we asked the question, what about, if you remember, Rab Yehuda, who had this ring, signet ring, and most important was that it was bolate. In other words, it was protruding, and we said that's still forbidden because of cheshodah. Cheshodah means there's a concern, a suspicion. Remember, we had this idea: always do things which are clean. You know it's correct, but it's got to not only be correct, it's got to look correct. And if he had this protruding image on his ring, there could be a suspicion that maybe, of course, unlikely, but nevertheless, you know, even the greatest are not above the law and above suspicion. And therefore, how was he allowed to do that? And we said he wasn't. And that's why Shmuel, his teacher, told him to erase, at least deface, that image that he had on his ring, because it was bolate. And it was, I say, protruding, and therefore you're not allowed to do that because there is this idea of suspicion. Don't do things, and it is forbidden, it seems, to have forms on signet rings which are protruding. And there is this idea of don't do things which could cause, this is not necessarily suspicion, but don't do things which could be considered that maybe you are using that form to worship. And the Gemara picks this up 6 lines up from the end. Umi chayshinon. Are we really concerned about this idea of suspicion? If you'll tell me, as somebody else forms something for you and there's no suspicion, but is everybody concerned? That's this idea. Do you have that? Are we really concerned about suspicion? That's the point. We raised last week, as I say, make sure everything you do is clean, not only in your own eyes, in Hashem's eyes, but to the public eye. Is there this concern of are we really concerned about suspicion? Do you really, if you know you're doing the right thing, and it is perfect what you're doing, are you really worried about other people? Look at this story. The Shaf v'Yosef. There was this shul in Shaf v'Yosef. What is that? And which was Nahador in Bovel. Have a look at the Rashi, please. It's about 10 lines up in Rashi. The Shaf v'Yosef. What's Shaf v'Yosef? and it was in Nahador. Says Rashi, it's a place called Shaf v'Yosef. Interesting name, Mokom who. It was a shul, and we'll find out more about this in one moment. Those words Shaf v'Yosef sounds like it's its name, but says Rashi, yes, Poishrin, there are some people who interpret how did a shul or a place get the name of Shaf and Yosef. It means it was destroyed and rebuilt. Shaf, the word destroyed and rebuilt. What does that mean? Have a look at Rashi, very fascinating point. Shechora v'choza v'nivneh, but Tomid, 7 lines up in Rashi. V'tomid hoyso shchina metzuyasham. The shchina of Hashem was always found in this shul. Why was that? Listen to this. V'yachonyo v'golusoi bon uhu. Yechonyo, when they went into exile before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, they went into exile. Bon uhu. They built this shul before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Yechonyo. Shenosu imohem me avnei Yerushalayim. They took with them from the stones of Yerushalayim. Have you got up? Beginning of line is Yerushalayim. Michael, good to see you. Yerushalayim, yep, 5 lines up in the Rashi, Chof Daled Amud Beis. We're talking about the building, the shul, which was destroyed. Well, obviously the stones were taken with them. Va'aleim ne'ema, about them it said, Ki rotzu avodecho es avoneho. Your servants wanted the stones of Yerushalayim. They took the stones of Yerushalayim. They took them with them as they went to Bovel. And that's the place, Shof v'Yosef ben Ador. Obviously a very special place with the wall, the actual stones coming from Yerushalayim. And in this shul, go back to the Gemara, please. What's special about this shul? Don't forget it was taken to Bovel, 5 lines up from the end of the Omud. Dahava be andata. In this shul, there was an andata. Have a look at Rashi, please. Tselem demus hamelech. There was a form of the king, Babylonian king. So you've got this form there, and we've said, if you remember, the form, the human form, having as a statue, is something which is not really permitted. Look at this list of people that used to come to this shul. Rav went there to daven, and Shmuel, Aili means go up. They would go up to this shul. Rav and Shmuel, not just Shmuel, Shmuel's father, Avuha de Shmuel, and Levi, another great personality. These are all very early Amoraim, some of them having seen the Tanoim as well. Umatzle Hosom. So what happened? There was a statue there, a statue of the king. It was insisted upon. And you would have thought that people wouldn't daven in a place like that. Why not? Umatzle Hosom. And people daven there. V'lo chaysha l'chshoda. Obviously, if they're davening in a place like that, there is always the suspicion that maybe they're actually praying to this statue. And nevertheless, they daven there. So what do you see from there? That the concern about suspicion is not a real concern, and do not worry about it. Says the Gemara, fascinating answer, Rabim Shani. Rabim are different. If you've got a lot of people coming there and everybody can see everybody else and what they're up to, they can see for themselves whether they're actually worshipping this statue or not. And therefore, if you've got Rabim, then it's true, the whole idea of suspicion falls away. Okay? Says the Gemara, just 1 minute. Let's go back. We've all been focusing on Rabbi Gamliel. And we explained about Rabban Gamliel, how Rabban Gamliel had these forms of the sun and the moon. And we said, why was that permitted? Well, okay, maybe certainly performing a mitzvah because he was checking and investigating the witnesses. But still, why was Rabban Gamliel allowed to have these pictures of the sun and the moon? And don't forget, Rabban Gamliel is an individual. And we said no one is above suspicion. You've got to come, I wouldn't say come clean, not only know that you're doing the correct thing, it's got to be obviously clear that you're doing the right thing. Now, these forms, the sun and the moon, even interesting, have a look at the Tosfos, the second wide line. For Rabban Gamliel Yochid. Rabban Gamliel is an individual. Now, again, what did we just say? If there are a lot of people together, then there's no suspicion because everyone can see what everybody else is doing. There's no suspicion. It's only when you're on your own, that's when things are forbidden. Even if somebody made the item for you, that we've still got the concern about suspicion. And therefore, how could Rabban Gamliel have these forms on his wall? Because isn't there the suspicion that maybe he's actually a sun worshipper, a moon worshipper in this case? Have a look at Tosfos, please. This is the penultimate Tosfos for Rabban Gamliel Yochid. So do we understand the question? The question we're raising is this. It may well be that someone else made these pictures of the moon for Rabban Gamliel, which he had up in his attic and with which he was testing the witnesses. But still, we've got the concern of suspicion. And if we've got the concern of suspicion, why was he allowed? Why did he have these forms? Now look at Tosfos, picks up a very important point. Tema, have you got the Tosfos? Second wide line in my Gemara, it's the penultimate Tosfos. Tema, v'hotzura de Rabban Gamliel lo hoyso boletes. Do you remember one of the points we made last week was that when are these forms, heavenly forms, forbidden? If they protrude, or you've got a statue of them. In other words, a 3-dimension, right? That's why we were talking about the signet ring of Rav Yehuda because it protruded. But he had pictures on his wall and they didn't protrude. So you can see clearly from Rashi, from Tosfos, that he did not actually have 3-dimensional forms of the moon, but only 2. And therefore, Tosfos asks, why is the Gemara concerned about suspicion? The Issa is only if it's in 3 dimensions, not 2. V'yesh Shlomo answers Tosfos, to mikol makom shaykh beichashoda gabi levona. When it comes to the moon, you still do have suspicion. Why? Ein chiluk, kiven de eino boletes parakia. If you're talking about a human form, humans walk around in 3 dimensions, most of them, the ones we know. And therefore, what's forbidden is to have a statue up of a human form unless it's defaced in some way. When you look up and see the sun and the moon, it's true, they may well be in 3 dimensions, but when you look up and see them, we just see from the earth the 2 dimensions of the sun and the moon. And therefore, it's interesting, when it comes to the pictures of the sun and the moon, we're not talking about a book up on your wall, pictures of the sun and the moon, that would be forbidden, even if they are only 2-dimensional. And therefore, we do have the question against Rabban Gamliel, how could he have these pictures on his wall? Because he is not above the law, and therefore suspicion would still be appropriate with him. You with me? Again, let me just summarize. If we're talking about the human form, what's forbidden for human form is three-dimensional, a statue. If we're talking about the sun and the moon, even 2 dimensions are forbidden. How was Rabban Gamliel allowed, therefore, to have these pictures of the moon on his wall? And it's very clear from Tosfos it was 2-dimensional, because that's all you see, and that's what's forbidden at home, on a wall. And why don't we have the concern? This was in Rabban Gamliel's attic, and therefore it sounds like there should have been a suspicion, shouldn't there? Says the Gemara, 4 lines up, for Rabban Gamliel Yochitu, Kiven de Nosihu, Shechiche Rabim Gabe. Very interesting. Because he was the Nossi, Rabban Gamliel, people were coming in and out of his attic, this room, perhaps there's a place where he was meeting people. And therefore, as people were coming in and out constantly, his time was not his own. Therefore, it's equivalent to Rabim. And therefore, as people would always be coming in and out, there would be no suspicion against Rabban Gamliel. Okay? Says the Gemara, a couple more answers here. Or if you like, I'll give you another reason why, in his case, it was permitted. Now, interesting, you'll see from the second answer, he says, de parokim. What does it mean, de parokim? It was made of parts. Oh, so this does sound like it was 3-dimensional, but it was made in parts. What does that mean? It was put together. He had different forms, and de parokim mean they were made of parts put together. They weren't actually up. When witnesses came, he would open up his box of tricks, and then put together pictures. Actually, it sounds like it was more. It was actually 3-dimensional copies of looking like the moon, different sizes, etc. And because it was only parokim, it wasn't made, you know what a perik is? It's a part of, as it was only a part of, therefore there was no concern. It was only put up when people came, the witnesses came. Otherwise, it was, as we say, it was liparokim. Yeah? So therefore, that's the reason why, in fact, it was permitted in his case. So this word parokim, normally translated, I say as like sections. And therefore, it wasn't assembled when witnesses weren't there. So therefore, it's a totally new answer here. So this idea of not having forms of the moon is not relevant to him, because in fact it was assembled when witnesses came. Otherwise it was, I say, put back in the box. Other people say the following. This doesn't answer the question about the cheshod. We mentioned that before. People were coming in and out, but we don't need to worry about making forms of the moon. Why? Because lihislamed ovad. We were very concerned about making form of the moon. Even if you concern and say that it's forbidden to have or make forms of the moon, however, you are allowed to do it lehislamed. The word lehislamed, normally it's to teach. The word limud, to teach ovad. But it doesn't just mean to teach, it means to learn and teach, and therefore also to examine. In other words, if you've got another purpose, therefore it would be permitted. And in fact, there's a posuk. The posuk says, there's a posuk, I've got this around the side, coming from Devarim, lo silmad la'asos. Don't learn to do like the abominations of the world, like the abominations that other people have, says the Gemara, but you can learn. Don't learn all about these abominations, but you are allowed to learn if you're doing it lahovin or lahoiros, to understand what they were up to, and therefore to teach what shouldn't be done. And therefore, if it's for teaching purposes or to understand what they were up to and therefore to know what's forbidden, then it is permitted. So just like one's allowed to study these abominations, if you're doing it for learning purposes, similarly in our example, Rabban Gamliel was allowed to make these, whether you say it was 3 or 2-dimensional, doesn't matter, because he's doing it for teaching purposes. And there's a pasuk which tells us that that is permitted. It sounds, therefore, he himself would be allowed. You don't need an answer to say that somebody else made this for him. He himself would be permitted to make these forms of the moon, whether on the wall or, I say, 3-dimensional, because he was doing it for teaching purposes. What about the concern about suspicion? Maybe he was worshipping it. Well, we've seen various answers. Either there were always people around him, people were coming in and out, and therefore that's not a concern. He was never on his own. As we've said, when they rub him around, you don't have this suspicion because people see what you're getting up to. Or we said it was assembled, and it wasn't actually up. It was assembled only when the witnesses came, and therefore put away after they left, and therefore, again, there will be no concern about suspicion. And with that, we close this Mishnah.
Norman, a question.
Yes.
My other hobby is taking photographs, and I take many of people.
Yes.
I've been doing so since I was 13. I'm just worried now that...
as we've just seen, when it comes to people, it's only if it's 3-dimensional. Are you taking 3-dimensional? You're making statues?
No.
No. So that's perfectly okay. Anyway, I suppose you do have pictures up afterwards if they're good photograph. When everybody does have their pictures up of all their family, etc., and that's perfectly okay. So as we've learned before, the idea of, I don't know whether people in some Gemaras at the back you've got the Shulchan Aruch. I don't know whether you have in your Gemaras, but I actually have the Shulchan Aruch near me here, and it's in chapter 141 in Yerodea. And just at the back of my Gemara, I do have that, and I'll read you what the Shulchan Aruch says as you've raised that, Peter. He says how it's forbidden, these diagrams and forms of heavenly beings. But it does say in the Shulchan Aruch itself, B'chein suras odom, kol elu osel asos, we said before, B'mer devarim amurim b'boletes. Boletes means where they protrude, as the human face does protrude. That's what would be forbidden. Aval b'shokas, indentation, when we had that idea with a ring, the signet ring, or it could be on a wall. However, the sun, the moon, the stars would be, for, as we see from our Gemara, unless it's for teaching purposes, like Rabban Gamliel, then that actually would be forbidden. Otherwise, it doesn't matter whether. So, it does seem like the Shulchan Aruch. Again, you can, if you have any pictures up of the sun. The full sun, of course, if it's not complete, you can have a picture of a crescent moon with a cloud going across it. That's fine, but otherwise, according to this one, should beware and careful. But certainly, pictures of individuals, Peter, keep going, and good hobby that is. So there you are. That's Rabban Gamliel, and that was the testing he was doing. Next Mishnah, gentlemen. Maaseh, it sounds a bit like back to the Seder night, does it? Maaseh b'Rabban Gamliel, all those Tanoim. But this is a Maaseh. It once happened Shebo'u Shanayim. Two witnesses came, but Omru, and they said, Ro'inuhu Shachris b'Mizrach. We saw the moon in the morning in the east. Va'arvis b'Marov. And we saw it in the evening in the west. Right? So have a look at Rashi. Rashi says we saw the old moon. They've just added that. Of course, they're being tested about the new moon, but they just threw out that comment that they saw the old moon in the east. And as we turn to the next Omud, gentlemen, we're now on Chofei Omud Aleph, moving along nicely. But Arvis B'Marv Es HaChadosha. They saw the new moon the same day, late during the day, or it sounds like towards it in the evening. We saw the new moon. Now, clearly, they're coming to testify about the new moon, which they say they saw that evening. Small, extremely small crescent moon. But they also threw out the comment that they saw the old moon first thing in the morning. Omar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now, do we remember the Gemara earlier on? Daf Chof Omid Beis? The time period where it's impossible. Do you remember this? Because of the moon, as it gets smaller and smaller, the crescent moon, and remember it's from the old moon, when I say the old moon, seeing one side of it, to seeing, remember, what happens, of course, is the moon as it goes across between the sun and the earth. Of course, if it was directly in line, it would be a solar eclipse, but normally it's not directly in line, but it's in the same plane. As it crosses that plane of the moon, between the earth and the sun, then it becomes invisible until it moves on, and then you start seeing, remember, the right-hand crescent as it moves on. Of course, the sun now shining, and you can see it. But if you remember the Gemara in Chof Omid Beis, remember we learned the Gemara there, and we said for 24 hours, it's not visible. As that crescent moves directly in front of the earth and between the sun, the size of that crescent is so small, there's going to be a 24-hour period that you're not going to see the moon, right? Now, these people say, we saw the new moon in the evening, but we still saw the old moon in the morning. Omer Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Got it? Top line of Chofhei. Eidei Sheker Heim. They are Eidei Sheker. As we explained, and Rashi's pshat, certainly according to his Rebbe's, he's got another pshat, but the first couple of lines of Rashi, Eidei Sheker Heim to Kaimalon, we are of the opinion, we've learned before, Esrim Barbo Shor Machse Siharo. The moon is not visible for 24 hours as it gets smaller, the end of the old month, until you move into the new month, and the visibility of that new moon, there's going to be a 24-hour gap. So that's impossible that they saw the old moon, as says Rashi, Kach Pirshu Rabboisai. He's got another pshat that when we need to see the Gemara for that. But at the moment, let's learn with the Pirush of his teachers, who said, as we've learned in Daf Chof, if you remember, for 24 hours, the moon is not visible. But these Eidim coming, saying they saw the new moon in the evening, but actually, funnily enough, we saw the old moon in the morning. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, sorry, gentlemen, I'm afraid that's not acceptable. Why is it not acceptable? As we've just said, they must be Eidei Sheker. Whether they did that purposely or not, it was on purpose, we don't know. But whatever happens, they are not going to be accepted. However, this is the interesting point. K'sheba'u leYavne, when they came to Yavne, Kiblon Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel that we just mentioned. Rabban Gamliel accepted them. Why did he accept them? The only answer is that Rabban Gamliel, checking them, and don't forget with all these pictures he had, checking them and knowing with his astronomical background that it was certainly possible to see the new moon in the evening, he accepted their testimony, albeit they said something. They said they saw the old moon in the morning. What he was doing, he was discounting that comment that they made. Have you got it? Chof Hey Omid Aleph. And even though they said something which sounded impossible, you couldn't see the old moon in the morning and the new moon in the evening, because he knew that it was possible to see the new moon that evening, he therefore discounted the comment that they made when they said they saw the moon, the old moon in the morning. He said that was just a mistake. It couldn't have been. And therefore, they are not false witnesses. But he discounted that and kept the first part of their testimony, the first part, the bit that we needed, which was that they saw the new moon in the evening. So even though there's a contradiction in the wording that they said, Rabban Gamliel said, I'm happy to accept their comment about the new moon. I know that old moon wasn't there, but it's not that I suspect them of being false witnesses and the whole thing's a pack of lies. I reckon that the morning was just a mistake, the cloud formation, etc. I know it was possible to see the new moon that evening. I've tested them. Remember, he had those pictures up in the wall.
Cruise station, our next station stop.
Yes, Peter, if we can perhaps come on to muting for people, unless they want to say something. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so that's an important point here. The Rabban Gamliel, yeah, we'll find out what's for supper later. Rabban Gamliel was happy to discard a comment rather than say these are. Now, if people really are false witnesses, they are well-known crooks, okay? With witnesses before well-known crooks, they would not be accepted for testimony, even if Rabban Gamliel would have known that what they're saying could be correct. False witnesses are not accepted. It's as simple as that. What Rabban Gamliel, however, was saying in this case, it's not that these people are false witnesses already. Their comments saying they saw the old moon in the morning, I know that's impossible. They haven't got a track record of being liars, and therefore I am happy to discount that on this occasion and accept their testimony about the new moon in the evening. Okay, that's one case. Then we have another case, second line down of the Mishnah. Va'oid bo'u shnayim. Two further people came. Va'omru, and they said, Ro'inuhu bismanoi. We saw the new moon, bismano, which means, and its correct time. Do you remember this correct time? We always talk about the correct, remember the month can be either 29 or 30. Bismano means in its earliest time. So after 29 days, they said, we saw the new moon. Ubeleil iburai, the next night, which is the night of the extra day, which they've already remember that they've already classified as day one. But had the witnesses not come, it would have been day 30. That night, lo nira, the moon was not visible. Wow. They went out to see the moon. Everybody, it's a clear night, and the moon doesn't seem to be visible. And also, on that occasion, Kiblon Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel accepted them. Wow. The moon was not seen the next night. for whatever reason. But Rabbi Gamliel accepted their earlier testimony. They said they saw the new moon. Now, if you saw the previous night, the new moon, you're going to see it the next night too, because at the beginning of the month, the moon is waxing. Yeah, not waning. It's waxing. It's getting larger, and it's getting more visible each day. So it looks like they must have given false testimony because the next day the moon was not seen. But nevertheless, Rabbi Gamliel accepted them. Omar Rabbi Dosa, oh, you'll like this comparison. Omar Rabbi Dosa ben Horkanus, the great Rabbi Dosa ben Horkanus. Actually, a generation earlier, an old man, Rabbi Dosa ben Horkanus, and he said, Eidei Shekeheim. You cannot have witnesses giving testimony like this when it's very clear that what they've given is false testimony. Why? Look at this comparison. Imagine people giving testimony that a lady has given birth. So it's like being not a new moon, a new birth. On the following day, interesting comment, way of explaining it. Her stomach, when you say between her teeth, in other words, a very large protruding stomach, like a 9th month, 2 days before birth, where you've got the whole fetus there going up, where he says Bein Shineha, in other words, a huge fetus the next day. Well, that's impossible. And what he's doing is comparing the same thing. Just like these Eidim have said there's been a birth, and the next day, the moon is not there. So it's like the Kuresa, her stomach is still there. The old moon must still be there. That's the comparison. So in other words, if it's clear that they're not telling the truth, then we should not accept the witnesses. That's what Abdosa said. Wow. Omar loy Rabbi Yeshua. We're now moving on, and we've got Rabbi Yeshua getting involved. So what happened? Rabbi Gamliel says we're accepting those witnesses when they came at the beginning. Rab Dosa ben Horkanus, generation earlier, an old man, a Zokain, saying you can't accept this testimony. Then you've got Rabbi Yeshua. Remember Rabbi Yeshua, the same generation as Rabbi Gamliel. Remember Rabbi Yeshua, when it says Rabbi Yeshua, it's Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania. He was one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Remember in Perek Sheni of Pirkei Avos, when he talks about the main Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Lozer ben Aroch. Remember the main Talmidim? Rabbi Yeshua of that same generation. Look what he says in our Mishnah. Omar lo Rabbi Yeshua, roye ani es devorecha. Your words seem correct, says Rabbi Yeshua to the great Rab Dosa ben Horkanus. What does that mean? It means that the testimony given that they saw the moon the previous night should not be accepted because the moon is not visible the next day. You with me? So Rabbi Gamliel has accepted those witnesses. Although the moon was not visible the next day, he is not retrospectively cancelling that testimony. He's saying that testimony stands. Rabbi Dosa says, sorry, they've been proven they're liars. And Rabbi Yeshua agreed with Rabbi Dosa. However, who is the Nossi? The Nossi is Rabbi Gamliel. He was accepting them. Wow. Whereas, and now it seems from this story, as you'll see in a minute, this was the Chodesh of Elul. It was Chodesh Elul, and Rabbi Gamliel accepted the testimony of those witnesses. In other words, Elul ended up being 29 days, as it almost always is, whereas Rabbi Yeshua And Rabbi Dosa said, nope, you cannot accept those witnesses if the next day you can see there's no new moon. However, the ruling goes with the Nossi. If the Nossi pronounces that that is the date of the Chodesh, and he may have had reasons to do that. Maybe he wanted a 29-day month. Do you remember also this principle of not having Yom Kippur falling on a Friday or on a Sunday? There are other rulings going on here. And Rabban Gamliel, even if it may be incorrect, the Chachomim have a power to announce when Rosh Chodesh is. And given that there were witnesses that said they saw the moon, Rabban Gamliel was very keen to pounce on that and say, yes, we're going to make today Rosh Chodesh. Even if it turned out later that it didn't seem correct, Rabban Gamliel has it. Now, we've learned this principle before, that the Chachomim, when the Bezdin have the power, and we'll mention this posuk in a moment, to be able to say that today is Rosh Chodesh, and therefore that's what he did. But Rabbi Yeshua disagreed. He said he shouldn't have done that. Now we've got an interesting case, because look what happened next. Sholach lo, it's getting quite exciting now. Sholach lo Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel sent him a message. This is Elul. And if you remember, Rabbi Yeshua said, no, you're a day out. Everything should be a day later. Right? But Rabban Gamliel said, no, it's a 29-day month. Everything a day earlier. Right? Rabban Gamliel sent Rabbi Yeshua a message. Look at this. Beginning of line is Rabban Gamliel. This is getting quite exciting. Goizrani olecha. I'm decreeing upon you. Shetodoi etzli. You should come to me, to the Bezdin. B'makelcha, with your stick. B'moisecha, together with your money, a purse, whatever you've got. On Yom Kippur, shechaldi yosef cheshbonecha. According to me, Yom Kippur is on a certain date, of course, we know, the 10th of Tishri. According to you, Rabbi Yeshua, you would call that the 9th of Tishri, wouldn't you? I know that because you didn't uphold what I was saying. I'm making a decree as the Nossi. I want you to come to me on the day you call the 10th of Tishri, which I have called the 11th of Tishri, and you're coming with your purse. Could be you're coming from quite a distance, so there's a tchum issue perhaps as well. I want you here together to show that you are buckling under and you are going to prepared to uphold what I not decreed, I accepted those witnesses. Says the Gemara, Motzoi Rabbi Akiva Meitzah. Rabbi Akiva, what's it going to do with Rabbi Akiva? Well, Rabbi Akiva actually is a Talmud of Rabbi Yeshua. So going down a generation, the Gemara explains Rabbi Akiva found him. I say found him, and as Rashi says, Holach u'motzoi. Holach u'motzoi. Actually, the Gemara will explain who meets whom. The Gemara explains Rabbi Akiva meets up with Rabbi Yeshua. Probably he's going to see him because after all he is his teacher. And Meitzah, what's Meitzah from Russian sorrow? Anguished. Look at Rashi. Meitzah, he's very upset about this. What is he meant to do? Have a look at Rashi. Beginning line is Meitzah. Have you got it? Holach u'motzoi. Rabbi Akiva goes and finds him. Holach u'motzoi. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yeshua. Meitzah. Very downhearted, very sad. Why? Al shahanosi goza olav lachalul yom kippurim. He's had a decree against him to desecrate Yom Kippur and come with his purse, etc. It could be coming from outside the area as well. But whatever happens, he's coming to Rabban Gamliel on a day which he feels is meant to be Yom Kippur. Continues the Mishnah. Have you got it? He says to him, Rabbi Akiva tries to comfort him. Yesh li lilmoid. I've got a posuk. Shekol ma she'osam Rabbi Gamliel. Even if you believe, and you might even be correct, that what he did was wrong, it doesn't matter, Rabbi Yeshua. Don't worry about it. Why? Shekol ma she'osam Rabbi Gamliel osu. Why? Shenema eile. We know this posuk. Eile mo'adei Hashem mikroi kodesh. These are the Yom Tovim, the holy days. Asher tikru oisom. You can call them. You call the tune here. When it comes to making the calendar, it's up to you. Asher tikru oisom. Have a look at Rashi, please. Asher tikru bikrias bezdin toloi akosov. The posuk is making it all depend on when the bezdin announces Rosh Chodesh. Continue the Mishnah. Bein bismanon, bein shloi bismanon. Whether it's on the right day, whether it's they've got it wrong, they've got it on the wrong day, it doesn't matter. Ein li moados elo elu. You only have Yomim Tovim, and if Ram Gamliel, as the Nasi, decided to make that day Rosh Chodesh, you've got to stick with it. He's showing him a posuk in the Torah. Don't worry, Rabbi Yeshua. Don't think he's made a mistake. It doesn't matter. Because a mistake is not a mistake. Because they can decree when they want Rosh Chodesh to be. So you may well be right astronomically. And not only that, the moon wasn't there the next night. But it doesn't matter. They can call when they want Rosh Chodesh to be. So that's the first thing. Don't forget, there was another gentleman here, this Rab Dosim and Hawkins, the elderly Rab Dosim. Interesting. The Bashar asks, why didn't Rabbi Gamliel ask for the sage, the old venerable sage, Rab Dosim and Hawkins, to come to him? They're agreed. Do you remember the Mishnah said, not just Rabbi Yeshua, but Rab Dosim ben Hawkins was also of the opinion that Rabbi Gamliel had made a mistake. So why didn't Rabbi Gamliel ask him to come? The Mashor suggests because Rabbi Yeshua was the Ab Bezdin, he was a Nasi, Rabbi Gamliel, but Rabbi Yeshua was the Ab Bezdin. Therefore, it was very important that the Ab Bezdin should show that he's following the principle of the Nasi. One answer. Another answer given by others is that because he was so old, he had a bit more Rahmanas on the old Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Dosa, and therefore he didn't ask him to come. Whatever happens, now look what happens next. Elo.
Can I just ask, Norman?
Yes.
Why didn't you could have brought another posuk? You know, the Afilo Mimchal small, in Tvorim, even if you could listen to the judges in your generation. You know, even if
good one. You'll say why? And that is coming up in a minute. That's a good point. You do have to listen when they paskin a shaila, but here it's better than that. You see, you don't have to get involved in thinking whether they're wrong or right, because the definition of right when it comes to the Chodesh is what's decreed. You with me? It's your answer. You've given an answer. You've got to listen to the rabbi. Absolutely, that's coming in a moment. There's more of that in the Gemara too. But this is a much better answer in the case of the Chodesh, because even if it's actually, if you like, in absolute terms, it's wrong. It doesn't matter because of what the Bezdin. Now you're right. If there's another the Bezdin can make a mistake. It's true we're paskening like the Bezdin, that's true. But what happens if they've actually made a mistake? They took witnesses and it never happened. The murder never took place. The Bezdin can make a mistake. And in that case, they will have to retract. It's true. You're quite right, Mervyn. You will follow the rule of the Bezdin unless they're proved to have made a mistake. If somebody's about to be hung, or hung's the wrong word, of course. But imagine that there was witnesses coming saying there was a murder took place, and then the murdered person actually suddenly arrives in the court. I mean, clearly the Beis Din, it was a mistake. Okay, nobody's saying they did it on purpose. They will have to back down. But you see, in this case, Rabbi Yeshua, you don't need to be worried about a mistake. It's not going to be a mistake, because the definition of the Rosh Chodesh is whenever the Rosh, we're talking about the Nossi, when the Nossi decrees and says Mekudesh, Mekudesh, that is the new moon. That is the definition of the Rosh Chodesh. So I said that's a better answer in this case. But what happened next? Now Rabbi Yeshua, he now meets up with a friend. Borlo Rabbi Yeshua, as Rashi says, he says, Omalai. Very interesting. So he goes to Rab Hawkins, Rab Dosa, almost to say, what am I meant to do? Especially because you're in my camp. You believe as well they've made a mistake. What am I meant to do? Does he agree to the statement Rabbi Akiva made or not? Omaloi, Rabbi Dosa said to him, and this is back to your point, Mervyn, if you're trying to say Rabbi Gamliel made a mistake, the same, you can always find faults, if you like, with a Beis Din. From the time of Moshe Rabbeinu onwards, you're going to pick a fight with a Beis Din. You can't do that. Shenema, the beautiful pasuk. If you remember the pasuk that talks about in Shemos, it speaks there by Ya'al Moshe, Ba'aron, Nodov, Ba'avihu, V'shivim Miziknei Yisrael. And Moshe and Aaron, Nodov and Avihu, and the elders, they went up the mountain, every person or every group at a slightly different level, but it doesn't mention their names. Wouldn't it be like in this week's Sedra, as Eretz Yisrael, I hasten to add, where we're leaning Bamidbar, it talks about the princes, and it tells me the 12 princes, remember Nachshon ben Aminadab. When it talks about the elders, it doesn't mention it doesn't mention 70 names. A couple of them are mentioned, but not 70. Says this Gemara here, or this Mishnah, why why are their names not mentioned? If they're elders, it would be a great covet, to mention the names. After all, we've got the Nesiim, and as I say, you've got Nachshon ben Nodov. Remember Pagiel ben Ochron, if you like that name. All the names mentioned coming up. Yes, you're quite right. It's smart from Benji. Pagiel. Remember, it's not Pagiel, not Pagwash. No, it's not Pagiel. It's Pagiel. I think we spoke about this before. But why their names are mentioned as being the princes? Why can't the Zakenium's name be mentioned? Look at this very powerful message here. Elo lelamed, second wide line of the Mishnah. Shekong shloisha. Any three that you have as a Beis Din, once they've been appointed as a Beis Din or Dayonim, she'omdu Beis Din al Yisrael, whenever they're appointed to be Dayonim, harihu ka Beis Din shel Moshe. They are like the Beis Din of Moshe. Have a look at the Rashi, please. Loma lo nispasu shemoisam. She'im bo odom. If any person comes along and says, "Acha Beis Din shebiyomov," we're about the Beis Din in their time, and they'll say, "V'chi Beis Din zeh k'Moshe v'Aaron or Eldod or Meidod." They're the only two elders mentioned. Somebody can always say, "Oh, I remember when we used to have dayonim and rabbis. What we've got today, it's not the real thing." You can always say to them, "The other names of the elders are not mentioned." It may well be that the other people were not such great Talmidei Chachomim. Their names are mentioned, especially for that point, that you can never say that the Dayonim you've got today are lower caliber to the Zakanim and the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, because their names are mentioned. Brilliant. And the reasons why their names are not mentioned, so that you should always say, whoever are your Dayanim, you give them the respect of Dayanim, and whatever they say stands. So this is a bit like you're saying, Mervyn, that not because whether it's right or wrong, you stick to the Beis Din. If the Beis Din have made a decision, you can come and discuss it with them if you like. Of course you can. But at the end of the day, they've made a decision, and this will cover now all aspects. If the Beis Din has if you think they've made a mistake, you go and talk to them about it. But at the end of the day, if they overrule you and they make a decision, you've got to follow what they said. Okay? This is what Rabbi Dosa told Rabbi Yeshua. So for all these reasons, Rabbi Akiva's reasons, or Rabbi Dosa, Rabbi Yeshua has to go to Rabbi Gamliel. Yeah? And look what happens next. Says the Gemara, Notal, you got the beginning line, Notal? Notal Makloi, he took his stick, Uma Oisov, and his purse, his money, his wallet, Biyodai, V'holach liyavne Eitzel Rabban Gamliel, and he went to Rabban Gamliel. On B'yoim Shechal Yom Kippurim Lias B'cheshvan. He didn't come a day late, but he went on that day, which according to him should have been Yom Kippur, but to show, and that's crucial, otherwise you end up with, two different Torahs in inverted commas. There's always got to be a decision. Decision is final, and therefore it's not, if you want, as I say, if you want to discuss it with the Dayanim, please do so. But at the end of the day, if they made a decision, you've got to stick with it. Look at this. Oman Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel stood up when this humble pie with Rabbi Yeshua coming. He embraced him. He gave him a kiss on his head. Omalai, boy b'shalom, come in peace. Rebbe the Talmidi. He appreciated the great caliber of Rabbi Yeshua, and therefore, yes, he's calling him Rebbe b'chochma. I admit you are actually my Rebbe in chochma. However, the Beis Din is the Beis Din, and we've made this decision. We can discuss it if you like, but that's the decision we've come to, and therefore you're Talmidi. You are my Talmid as far as that's concerned. Shekibalto es devori. You've done the right thing. You've accepted, rather than, notice out in the newspapers, these Rabbonim, they don't know what they're talking about, and we're now setting up a new Beis Din. Rabban Gamliel doesn't know what it's. If you've been appointed Rabban Gamliel and your Beis Din, then that is the rule. The rule stays with them, and therefore he embraced him, telling him, yes, I appreciate your great wisdom, but you've also got that wisdom that you're prepared to accept the ruling of the Beis Din, rather than having two different Botei Dinim, and therefore that's crucial here, and therefore with that, all was left hopefully happily ever after. Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, the Gemara will follow this through. So with that, gentlemen, nice to finish on this happy note, or so we think. Thank you very much, Peter. Are we okay for next week? All being well? Next week, Wednesday, yeah? Yeah. Okay, very good indeed. I hope everybody's well. Good to see you with us, Sam, as well. Good. Michael, good. Mervyn there. Mervyn, you well?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I lost the connection. I'm on a train.
Yeah.
I lost my connection. Sorry, just 1 minute.
Yeah, so sorry, yes, something? You can, I've come off because otherwise I'm the bandwidth, as they say. Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, just the other thing. Why do they have to bring in Eldad and Medad? You've already got your three. You've got Moshe.
No, very good.
Aaron, Nod of Avihu. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Sorry?
Oh, no. Nadav and Avihu, if you remember, those were the people going up the mountain, plus the Zakanim. Right? We now focus, who are those Zakanim? Says Rashi, we don't know who those elders are. Because if you remember, the Pasuk in Ma'aloscha does tell us about Eldad and Medad, Misnabim and Makneh. They were part of this group. So in other words, you do have some names that are mentioned. The others, you don't hear about any Zakanim.
That's all you needed to know, isn't it?
Oh, no, you're true. But the point we're trying to get across is the only names we hear about in Ma'aloscha, we've got Moshe, Aaron, Eldad, and Medad. We don't know any other names of the Zakanim. We're not talking here about Nadav and as mentioned there before. We're looking at the Zakanim. The Zakanim mentioned in Ma'aloscha, the only names we've got are those four. We don't have any other names, that's all. So the principle is, why don't we have those other names? So you can always say your Bezdin that you've got in 2022, they may be actually a higher caliber than some of those others that came in. Now you may say, oh, come on, but the answer to that will be, well, we don't know who they are. So maybe the Zakanim that were taken were people of a lower caliber of the Dayanim you've got today. And exactly for that reason, the names aren't mentioned. That's the point. Yes, of course, you've got your three people, etc. But the point that Rashi is getting across, or the Mishnah, is why are no other names of the Zakanim mentioned for this point? Now, if you're a betting man, you probably say, well, those Dayanim and Zakanim they had in those days, of course, it was the generation of Kabbalah, Satorah, etc. True, but nevertheless, the names are mentioned to get that message across. That don't ever belittle the Dayanim that we have today and say, well, it's nothing like the real what a real Zokin is meant to look like, or the type of knowledge they're meant to have. No, you've got what you've got, and that's it. And therefore, you stick with the halachas of today, with the Dayanim and their decrees. With that, gentlemen, wish you well. Hope you're well, everybody. Okay.